Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gaming Tech.com video, we're going to be talking about the Xbox One versus PS4 and the actual specifications of the machine in terms of the resources that are available for gaming and what differences that's going to make for titles that are available on both systems, and almost cross-platform games, So obviously there are quite a few differences between the two systems. However, there are a lot more similarities than what there are differences, especially when it comes to the GPU and CPU. So we're going to talk about what the Xbox One has, and we're going to talk about the PS4, then we're going to talk about the differences between them. Now, the first is going to be the Xbox One, just simply because, why not? Now, the Xbox One is very unique in that a lot of resources are basically used for the free OS configuration. Now, I've spoken about one of the reasons I don't like this, but we're going to really hammer into that in this particular video. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the triple operating systems and how they work in this video, because it's actually quite a complicated subject, and it would actually go into virtualization technology. And actually, I started to re-record this video because I literally was speaking about it for 7 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that, and I hadn't even started to break the surface of how it works, so I'm going to have to do that in another video, and I'll show you guys how virtualization works as well, possibly. But for this video, we're just going to be talking about what the operating systems do in a very brief overview, and then we're going to move on to this hardware, then we're going to move on to the PS4, okay? So, the Xbox One, SLAP, Xbox One's operating system uses a base OS, which is a Windows 8 type of OS, and that's basically the very base OS that the other two are running from. Now, this main OS can be updated throughout the life of the console. However, it will be used to do stuff such as Skype and other titles such as Internet Explorer and all that other good stuff. One of the purposes behind this is that it can, of course, do a lot of the multitasking that the Xbox One is becoming infamous for. It will also be running Hyper-V. Don't really worry about that. It's just a way of virtualization. In other words, another operating system. I will explain that in the not-too-distant future, I promise. And that will be running a dedicated Xbox OS, which will spring to life primarily and take the forefront when a game is loaded. In other words, when you put, say, Call of Duty or whatever title into the system, it will say, oh, I've got something to do and be happy and so forth. That will be fixed as far as we understand it. In other words, it will not be significantly updated, if updated at all, unless maybe there's bug fixes or whatever, or performance improvements, just simply to keep continuity between the game titles. In other words, so they don't decide to fall over halfway through, say, the console's life and break one title. And finally, there's a third operating system, and that will basically be there as a small, tiny little layer, and just basically assist with virtualization and allow the two main operating systems to talk to one another. So in other words, it acts as intermediary. Once again, we'll go into a lot more about this in another video, but just for now, you've got a brief overview. Fantastic. It has a APU design, of course, which is very much like the PlayStation 4, although it does have some differences, primarily involving the GPU. Now, we're not exactly sure what the clock speeds are yet because, well, it's as simple as Microsoft haven't revealed them. There are conflicting reports on this one, and I'm not going to go too much into the details because it's quite a long and in-depth discussion, but it's basically to do with the fact that we're not really sure if Microsoft have underclocked the GPU or not, but let's just say that they have not for the purposes of this video, because the other one is just a rumor, so I'm going to go with the fact they haven't because it's fairer on comparison. And so, for the purposes of this video, we're going to assume that it is running at the assumed clock speed, and therefore we have 1.24 teraflops of computing power to deal with. It has 8 CPU cores, AMD Jaguar, and once again, all of this is part of the AMD Jaguar APU anyway. Of course, on that same APU, it's 32 megabytes of ES RAM, as well as the Move engines. As a very brief overview, Move engines are simply there to shuttle data backwards and forwards and reduce the overhead of the consoles. Basically, reduce the overhead on the console itself. But if you're not sure what the Move engines are, even from that little tiny explanation, or you want more information, I have got another video. It's quite a short one, but it does go into what Move engines do and so forth. Now, as I've discussed heavily, one of the purposes of the ESRAM is to make up for the bandwidth issues with DDR3, and we're going to talk a bit about that in a moment as well. I know I'm putting some stuff off, it's just the way we've got to do the video, because otherwise it's going to be a bit of a convoluted mess. As for the PS4, it's a lot easier to explain. It has one base OS as far as we understand it so far. It's using GDDR5 RAM, and of course that inherently does mean it's a lot easier to program for. It also has the AMD APU. However, one of the reasons that the GPU of the PS4 is more powerful is simple. It has used the space on the APU, the die in other words, for more GPU cores, rather than going through the move engine's ESRAM. The reason behind this, as I mentioned in another video, but I just want to repeat it in case you guys have missed it, is simply because Microsoft decided that DDR5 may not be a good idea because of yields, and so they decided to pack all that space with, sacrifice all that space for ways to make DDR3 more viable. Sony, on the other hand, did the absolute reverse, and they said, you know what, it's GDDR5 or bust. And you can actually tell that they were becoming more and more confident because the amount of memory the PS4 had increased over time. I believe it did start out as 2 gigabytes, and then no one, wanted that at all. Developers just laughed at it, and then 4 gigabytes, and then of course now we've got to the 8 gigabytes mark, which is pretty damn fantastic in my personal opinion. So, that gives us about 1.84 T-flops of computing power, which is substantially more than that of the Xbox One. So, the question you've got to ask yourself is, what else differences are there? Now, the problem is, the games developers as a whole, when they're creating a game, one of the benefits, of course, of the x86-64 architecture is it's really like developing for a PC. And you can see this as a primary benefit for those who are, say, on a smaller budget developing, or even big AAA titles, because they're becoming increasingly prohibitively expensive actually to develop for. An example of this is the budgets of The Last of Us and so forth. Games developers now are doing their best to hide the budgets and how much they cost, but there is emerging trends now that are saying that the direction of AAA games is no longer. It's going to come to basically a point where they can't keep going like this because of the price to develop for them. It's going to get to the point where they're becoming more and more expensive, yet the sales don't really increase that much, and so they become less and less profitable, and therefore cheaper to develop games are going to become bigger. This is one of the reasons, of course, the proliferation of DLC. So, but that's a different topic, but I just wanted to put it out there. So one of the primary benefits, should I say, of x86-64 is it's a very familiar, easy to access architecture that already has a tons of tools available for it. Now, we've spoken about the ease of getting titles working on the PS4. And indeed, the developers behind Warframe actually did a recent interview, and indeed I covered that interview if you want to check it out, on just how easy it was. It was just a couple of months really for them to get a PC version of the code working on the PlayStation 4 because of how easy and similar the two architectures are, which bodes really well, by the way, for more PC versions of games rather than, oh, okay, guess we're not going to be seeing that on PC then, or ridiculously long wait times, which really pisses me off, but that's an aside. So, the really good news is that we're going to be seeing a lot better titles in that regard. Now, the question you've got to ask yourself, and this is the $64 million, this is a $1 billion question, regardless, 64, just how much of a difference is it going to be between the PS4 and Xbox One versions of games? Now, we've already spoken about the amount of memory that is physically on the console. However, the amount of memory on the console doesn't mean really jack. The amount of usable memory, and that is the key word, usable memory, the usable resources are what really matters. Because, I'll give you guys an example. The Wii U, of course, Nintendo's contribution to next generation, it says with quotation marks, has 2 gigabytes of RAM, yet 1 gigabyte is available for the game. So in other words, if you to open it up, you know nothing about the system, you just to look at the memory available on the board, you would say, oh sweet, this system has 2 gigabytes of memory, and that would be all she wrote. However, realistically and feasibly and truthfully, the system only has 1 gigabyte. Now, I've mentioned before, Nintendo are apparently working internally to increase that amount to whatever number it is. We don't have a number, so let's say 1.2, 1.5, whatever gigs of RAM. But for now, it has 1 gigabyte available for games, which is not that great, really. Now, the Xbox One, and this is the key, has 5 gigs available for games compared to that of the PlayStation 4's 7. The reason behind this is basically to do with the operating system. I actually put out a recent video which was going into what I really wish they would change on the Xbox One in regards to make it a lot more powerful and a lot more competitive to that of the PlayStation 4. Now, I'm not saying the PS4 is going to stomp on the Xbox One. This isn't a, PS4 rocks and Xbox One sucks, because that's just crap, yeah? And I've already spoken out heavily against my, against the fact that Edge magazine have actually featured the fact that they believe the PS4 is going to win the console war, and they say it's the next console you're going to own, and I really don't like that philosophy. I don't subscribe to that, because in my personal opinion, it is not only biased, it's not good reporting. Okay, if you want to give your opinions, fine, but I understand they're trying to be sensational to sell magazines, but I've gone into that before anyway. So anyway, we know that the memory is unified, and obviously, brief overview of what unified is basically it is shared between the CPU and the GPU. So I'm sure you'll agree that 2 gigabytes is actually a fair chunk of memory. To give you a better understanding of how much that really is, the PS3 and Xbox 360 only have 512 megabytes of RAM. In other words, we're talking 4 times that amount that is basically going to be unusable. To further illustrate this as well, there are somewhat slight concerns regarding the GPU. Now, the GPU, apparently, we do know that is going to be less powerful than that of the PS4. However, in recent interviews, we do know that the GPU itself is going to be having 10% of its performance used by the graphics card. And in addition to that, we know that the CPU itself is going to have 2 of the 8, so in other words 6 available for games, used for the operating systems as well. That's fairly substantial. Now, what about the PS4? This is a bit harder to know. Developers and publishers so far haven't, and Sony themselves. As far as I understand it, if I'm wrong here, feel free to slap me upside the head with a comment on this video, or better still on Facebook. That's facebook.com/redgamingtech. I'm much more likely to read it. We don't 100% know just how many CPU cores are available for the PS4. Now, I've talked about this before, but the best we've got, as an educated guess, is that of Guerrilla Games' breakdown of Killzone. Now, I've done this as a big video as well, so you can check that out. But basically, there are 8 CPU cores, of course, inside the PS4, each capable of handling 1 thread. In a breakdown of the usage of the how much CPU usage, basically, that Killzone was using on the PS4, we saw that there were 6 threads running. So, in other words, that's 6 of the 8 CPU cores. Now, that isn't a confirmation that there are 2 that are unavailable. Why? Because it could mean, and I emphasize the word could with huge capital letters, that it's simply Sony saying to them, look, we're not sure what the resources are going to be yet, and so we advise you guys just to use 6. For all we know, that's the case. It could be that that's all the Killzone needed, or it could be that, no, sorry, 2 CPU cores are going to be reserved for operating system functionalities. When you think about it, such as the sharing feature for the PS4, it's actually possible that that is actually the case. What about GPU resources? Well, once again, I've not found any evidence of this. I have searched, but I haven't found anything. I found a couple of random threads and so on, or rumors, but not anything that's substantial or any sources, so I'm going to stay away from them and not even bother to mention them. So, even if, however, we say that it is the same 10%, that still, of course, means the Xbox One is substantially behind that of the PS4. Now, why is it the Xbox One actually has those resources, those GPU resources actually allocated in it? It's actually quite simple. It's basically to hardware accelerate, if I had to guess. This has not been confirmed as far as I understand it, but if I'm just giving a couple of guesses, hardware acceleration of, say, video streams, UI menus, Aero, all of that uses GPU power, and so it would make sense that, well, you don't want those resources to suddenly be taken away from a game. One of the reasons that they actually allocate these resources, let's assume, just for a moment, that they were to say, okay, you guys use whatever you want. That's not really feasible, because one of the purposes behind actually creating a console is that the specifications are actually fixed, minus one or two little bits and pieces, such as hard drive size, of course. And the purpose behind this is so that your Xbox or PlayStation will perform the same as my Xbox or PlayStation. So, if, for example, they were to allocate all of these resources on the GPU, or say 7 of the 8 CPU cores, what would start happening is you would start getting slowdown and lag between switching, so it wouldn't be so seamless. And of course, Sony themselves got heavily bashed for that on the PS3. To be fair to them, they have done some updates which did improve the dashboard and the overall operating system of the PS3, but I wouldn't personally call it as smooth as the Xbox. That's just my personal opinion. Even though I primarily game on the PlayStation, I'm not going to lie to you, but I think personally the experience of the PlayStation is not as smooth as that as the Xbox. I think overall the Xbox does feel a lot smoother in terms of messaging, dashboard, and just overall smoothness, especially when you're installing demos and games and updates and so forth. And both developers, especially Sony, basically made it one of their mission focuses to make gaming smooth and easy and simple. So the question is, of course, how much of a difference is there going to be between that? Is that going to really negatively impact titles which are across both platforms? And it'll be very interesting to me just what that means. I mean, there are already those who are predicting the Xbox One versions of the games running at, say, 720p, with the PS4 versions of the games running at 1080p. Now, Microsoft, of course, are extremely diligent in pointing out certain functionalities, and we already know what I'm going to say, don't we? Yes, cloud. Now, to be fair to Microsoft, they're investing an absolute crap ton of money. I think it's like 700 million, I believe was the figure. I was pulling that completely out of my memory bank, so it could possibly be a few million either way, but around 700 million in a new data center. And apparently they're going to increase that as well, so they're going to further expand that. Plus, they've already got, of course, the Windows as a service anyway, so in other words, it's an expansion of a service and a plan to expand upon that expansion, if that made any sense. Now, the purpose behind that is basically that they say that they're going to allocate a certain amount of Xboxes on the cloud, so in other words, basically cloud performance. Now, I've spoken about this heavily before, and it does definitely have some major uses, as I've spoken about before, but I'll just go over it briefly again. One of the primary reasons for me that it exists, and one thing I really like, is to make worlds persistent. One argument I would have about titles like Skyrim or GTA is they're really cool, but the world basically ceases to exist once you switch off or turn off the game. In other words, when you eject the disc, put it in a different game, it simply ceases to exist. That world no longer works. And obviously it's not really realistic for that world to still be playing in the system's memory and for changes to be occurring, because obviously how many games could that realistically happen for? In other words, your system only has finite resources. So one of the purposes of cloud, of course, would be that in theory at least your world could keep evolving and changing and so on. Another purpose, of course, would be developers of Titanfall have already been really outspoken about this, about matchmaking and virtual servers. And as I said, it's very easy to spin up resources in a matter of seconds, and Microsoft actually do it really cheap for them as well, so they can actually create dedicated servers and so forth really easily. It could also handle things such as AI and physics, which will no doubt be used for certain titles, weather effects and so on as well. My primary concern, however, with all of this is latency, and another issue I have is a very simple one. Let's say that you have a developer. I'm not going to bother to name names, but let's just call them John. Okay, so John the developer. And John the developer says, well, okay, we're going to make a title for the PS4 and the Xbox One. They've only got limited budgets. My concern is the Xbox One version really going to really heavily utilize the cloud? One of the reasons that I'm concerned for this is that, as I said earlier, development budgets are going up all the time. And so if the cloud is really easy to use and offers very, very simple benefits real fast, developers are probably not going to want to utilize it. I didn't say they won't, but I don't necessarily know if they're going to be using it for as much stuff as what they possibly could be. So one of the concerns I've got is just how we're going to be seeing titles on both systems, and is the Xbox One going to be slowing down the uptake, shall we say, of new system worlds? Obviously, a console doesn't have to necessarily be powerful to have awesome games on it, and no one for the right mind is thinking not, but it could well mean that we could be seeing inferior Xbox versions of the titles, and this has already been one of the concerns. I mean, I'm already seeing people worry about the PS4 titles just dominating the Xbox in terms of either the frames per second or the resolution. Now, let's just be completely and utterly honest here. One of the major things that I would say is that at launch we're going to be seeing a lot less differences than what we are 2 years down the line. One of the reasons, as you guys are probably guessing, is simply that as developers become more and more used to hardware, in other words, as they become more akin to how the hardware works and how they can push it, it's going to make quite a difference. Another concern that I have off the bat was the differences in memory. Now, in a recent interview with Mark Cerny, well, not really an interview, who's giving a lecture. It's quite a long one, about 44 minutes, and it's available on YouTube, not on this channel. You'll have to search for it, so by all means do so. I can't remember the title, but basically he just gives a conference on what his goals and ambitions are for the PlayStation and what his history is of work. And he did make a couple of digs actually at Microsoft, and one of them was regarding their choice of ESRAM and DDR3. Now, that is to say that DDR3 RAM doesn't have some advantages. One of those major advantages regards latency, in other words, the fact it's lower. But it also has some distinct issues with this method. One of them is that you've only got 32 megabytes of data, effectively, that can be fully utilizing a heavy amount of bandwidth. In other words, the rest will have to be relegated and pushed into what is effectively lower bandwidth. And so no one in their right mind expects, of course, a game. I mean, I'm just going to use Killzone again, even though I've used it dozens of times now, but it's not like they're using 1 gigabyte of video data or 2 gigabytes. I think it was like 3 or so gigabytes of video data, which is pretty damn high. Now, obviously, that's because of their architecture. If they did it differently on the Xbox One, it would be blah, 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 blah. But the purpose is the fact that they could do that. They could be silly. I'm not saying silly as in the developers don't know what the hell they're doing, but they could just say, this is what we're doing, this is our way of doing it, that's all there is to it. And as I said, there are definitely going to be improvements in the way they program. For example, one of the things they already said is the fact that they needed to use small pixel formats and a few other bits and pieces as well, and there is definitely optimization still there. But my concern is that the Xbox One, this method could well limit. Now, there definitely are going to be improvements. one of the issues, of course, one of the latest discoveries is that Microsoft have found that their ESRAM actually performs far better than what they originally thought it would, due to the fact that the final production, can read and write simultaneously, I believe. So it's really down to debate actually how much improvement it is. I've heard a couple of conflicting reports on that one, so I'm going to be doing some analysis on that over the next couple of days. I've already put out one video on that, but I've heard some updated information, so I'm going to check that out over the next couple of weeks, because there's an internet war going on that very issue, believe it or not. So yeah, I'm a bit concerned, to say the least, on what exactly they're going to be doing on this particular issue. And I do really wonder just how Microsoft are going to be encouraging developers. Obviously, a lot of this comes down to Microsoft's own documentation, as well as Sony's, of course, but what we understand, Sony's are basically like the saint. I'm not saying that to be biased, but I haven't seen one bad word against Sony yet from developers, recently anyway. Maybe I'm not looking hard enough. I have looked. I haven't found any regarding the PlayStation 4's architecture. Even Epic, although they were a little bit disappointed with GPU performance, they wanted it to be higher. They have said they've been really overall happy with the system. Memory, GPU, whatever, has always got some level of praise in there, specifically and primarily on how easy it is to develop for. So we'll have to see. So I am concerned that we're going to be seeing lacking multi-platform. In other words, we're going to be seeing the Xbox One titles worse, is basically what happens. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to be like PS1 versus Saturn. Now, the Saturn, of course, had numerous issues. The Saturn's issues actually were quite funny, and in case you guys aren't familiar, the Saturn, of course, was a 32-bit console that was in competition with the PlayStation. But Sega basically panicked when they were developing the system. And when you panic, you sometimes make rash decisions. And their rash decision was, rather than say, you know what, we're going to postpone the launch a little bit, we're going to do X and Y, and we're going to try and bolster up the system. Instead, they just said, you know what, let's just throw in every bloody component we can. And so they didn't even bother to customize the parts, and this led to a couple of issues. Firstly, they had a couple of processors and a couple of GPUs in there, which meant like a multi-GPU and CPU configuration. And this was at a time where it wasn't exactly commonplace like it is now, where even your phone has a bloody multi-CPU. Second issue was that they couldn't cut down the price of the system. And I'm not saying it's like that because, well, it doesn't really make sense, but there have been numerous systems, of course, that have been inferior power-wise to the competitors. On the other hand, one could also argue that there have been numerous examples. I've used the Game Boy, for example, multiple times, how it just basically constantly seemed to rabbit punch any competitors that seem to be facing it. I'm talking the numerous iterations of the Game Boy as well, including the 3DS and so forth. It just seems to just say, well, that's real nice. You've got, specs that dwarf mine. You've got color. I've got green screen. Still, I'm going to ruffle stomp you. And this is one of the reasons for that, of course, is the fact that they've got the software for it, which ultimately is what's going to sell your system. I don't care how pretty you dress something up. Ultimately speaking, if it's a pile of crap, and you just paint it gold, congratulations, you've got a pile of crap. This excrement, however, is now just painted with gold. No one is going to want that excrement. It's still excrement at the end of the day. And this is really what it comes down to. You're going to want to see the games that are going to be system sellers. And so, while multi-platform games are going to be an issue, I think it's going to be just how easy it is to develop for, how easy the platform is as a whole to work with. All of these are going to be huge components of whether the system itself is going to be not competitive, shall we say, with the PlayStation. Because the thing is, the PlayStation 3 was a bitch to program for. Sony have admitted so. They said that it was a nightmare. Their own development teams had problems with the PlayStation 3. Simple as that, black and white answer. It was just a pain in the butt to work with. It was a ridiculously powerful system, But to do it, you basically had to learn multiple secret handshakes just to unlock the power of the cell's SPUs. Once you did so, then you had a world of power behind you, but to get to that point, you basically had to make blood sacrifices. And I'm pretty sure some people probably actually were banging their head against the desk a few times at some points as well. And this was one of those things where Mark Cerny himself said that they basically developed the hardware first, and then they were like, well, to the team, yeah, you deal with that and figure out what you can write on the code. It wasn't a case of the software and the hardware guys working hand in hand, which you'd expect, really. Instead, they basically developed the SPU and then, the cell processor, and they said, okay, what can you do with this? And so there wasn't really the communication there behind them. And Microsoft, of course, had the PowerPC architecture as well, which is similar-ish, but their CPU layout was a hell of a lot easier to work with. So we're going to have to see just what happens come up, say, December, January time for the initial launch games, but I'm not even so interested in the launch games, actually. I'm interested in what we're going to be seeing 2 to 3 years from now. I want to see what we're going to be seeing in 2014, late 2014 and 2015. I think we're going to start seeing if there are going to be any major differences between the two versions. And honestly, looking purely at the numbers, and Microsoft, of course, has said their only numbers, in my opinion, we're going to see just how much of a difference the cloud makes. And, well, if numbers are just numbers. So, yeah. Anyway, this has been a bit of an itsy-bitsy video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Nevertheless, I will see you soon. As per normal, if you want to get hold of me via direct comments, so in other words, you want to ask a direct question, you are much better to do so on Facebook. That is not me ignoring you. That is me simply saying that I often don't read comments because sometimes on tech videos, especially, I get 40 to 100 comments plus on videos, and it's pretty much impossible for me to trawl through all of them on the fact that I work and do everything else and put out so many videos and edit and run a site and everything else. It's not an excuse, it's just a fact, unfortunately. I'd love to be able to spend all my time to answer all the stuff, but I just simply can't. So if you've got something you want to say, the best option is to go to facebook.com/redgamingtech and address it to me, the person who's creating this video, which would be Paul/Crimson Rain, whatever you want to say, and you will say hello to me, and I will do my best to respond back. I will respond back as quickly as possible. Be warned, this might sound a bit obvious, but I only speak English, and I would love to speak different languages. I'd love to speak German, for example, and Japanese, and a couple of others. However, I can't. And so I've had a few people write messages in non-English to me, and I'm not being harsh, I simply cannot understand it. And sometimes Google Translation, especially if you've mistyped a couple of words, I don't understand what you've said. I'm sorry. It's that simple. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Anyway, I'm going to get going. I will hopefully see you soon. Take care, and bye for now.